So I want you to just take a second and think about what it actually takes to bring a global superpower to a grinding halt.
Right. It's hard to even picture.
Exactly. Because if you were asked to imagine a threat capable of completely rewiring the modern world, altering global policy, launching decades of war, permanently changing the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people, you would probably picture something massive.
Yeah, you'd think of like a coordinated strike by a hostile nation state or some complex nuclear standoff.
Right, or a sprawling state-sponsored military invasion. We are just naturally conditioned to expect the cause to equal the effect.
We really are. We assume that a machine as vast and, well-funded as the United States national security apparatus can only be shaken by an opposing force of equal size and sophistication.
But when you actually step into the forensic timeline of the September 11th attacks, that entire framework just shatters. Trace the events of that day all the way back down to their mechanical roots, and the origin point is, it's chillingly small.
It's incredibly small.
The entire plot, which shifted the trajectory of global history and led to an estimated 4.5 million indirect casualties over the next 20 years, was executed by 19 men.
19 men.
And 19 men who did not possess heavy artillery. They didn't have complex hacking software. They were armed with multifunction hand tools and pepper spray.
Yeah, it's wild. They did not defeat the United States military in open combat. They exploited a massive systemic failure of imagination.
Which is just staggering. So welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack what is universally recognized as the defining event of the 21st century. And to do this, we're looking at a massive, incredibly dense stack of sources.
Oh yeah, we have a ton of material to get through.
We really do. We've got comprehensive historical timelines compiled by the Miller Center, the exhaustive summaries and findings of the 9/11 Commission report.
Which is a heavy read on its own.
It's very heavy. Plus, detailed engineering analyses from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and these encyclopedic accounts covering the intelligence failures, the operatives, and the staggering two-decade aftermath.
Right. And, the intention here is not simply to recount a tragedy that you are likely already familiar with on a cultural level.
No, not at all.
The goal is a forensic examination of the machinery behind the event. We're looking at the specific systemic blind spots that allowed it to happen.
The minute-by-minute tactical execution on the morning of the attack.
Exactly. And the immediate geopolitical shockwaves that just permanently altered the world you live in today.
So the sources make it abundantly clear that this wasn't just a sudden thunderbolt from a clear blue sky. Right?
No, you don't just wake up one morning and accidentally execute a synchronized multi-target hijacking.
Right. The origins of this plot stretch back years. They're deeply rooted in a very specific set of geopolitical grievances. So where does the actual documented blueprint for this operation begin? Because the timeline definitely doesn't start in 2001.
No, it doesn't. The ideological foundation was really laid in the mid to late 1990s. To understand the genesis, the sources direct us to 1996 and 1998.
Okay, what happened then?
That's when Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, issued 2 fatwas.
Right, and a fatwa was...
Well, in Islamic tradition, a fatwa is a legal ruling or interpretation issued by a qualified jurist. But bin Laden lacked those formal credentials, so he just used the term to issue declarations of a holy war against the United States.
And the sources outline the stated motives behind those declarations very specifically, right? He wasn't just issuing vague threats.
No, he had a distinct list of grievances. Primarily, he was motivated by intense anger over the presence of United States military forces in Saudi Arabia.
Which stems back to the Gulf War.
Exactly. That military presence was established during the 1991 Gulf War. And you have to remember, Saudi Arabia contains the 2 holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina.
Right.
So bin Laden viewed the sustained presence of non-Muslim Western troops on that soil as a profound desecration.
Okay, that was the primary issue. What else was on the list?
Beyond that, his declarations explicitly cited the United States' unwavering support for Israel and the international sanctions placed on Iraq following the Gulf War.
Sanctions which, he and many others claimed were causing devastating civilian casualties and suffering.
Right. And the 1998 declaration was explicit about the rules of engagement. He stated that it was the duty of his followers to kill Americans and their allies. And this is crucial, he did not differentiate between military personnel and civilians.
The target was the nation as a whole.
Exactly. But Issuing a declaration from a cave complex in Afghanistan and actually possessing the operational capacity to strike the mainland United States are two vastly different things.
Yeah, words are one thing, execution is another.
Right. Al-Qaeda needed a tactical blueprint, and that blueprint was brought to them by a man named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Who is frequently referred to in the intelligence documents as KSM, right?
Yes, KSM. And KSM wasn't some grassroots recruit. He had a very specific, relevant resume when he arrived to pitch his idea to bin Laden in 1996.
He was highly connected.
Incredibly ambitious and globally connected, he was the uncle of Ramzi Youssef.
Wait, Ramzi Youssef, that's the guy who orchestrated the first bombing of the World Trade Center back in 1993, right?
That's him. And KSM and Youssef had also collaborated in the Philippines on this massive, highly complex terror scheme known as the Bujinka plot in 1995.
Okay, I really want to highlight the Bujinka plot because reading the sources, it honestly feels like the rough draft for 9/11. What were they trying to do in 1995?
The Bujinka plot was terrifying. It involved smuggling liquid explosives disguised in contact lens solution bottles onto multiple commercial airliners flying over the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
And the plan was to detonate them all simultaneously.
But they got caught, right?
They did. The plot was thwarted when a fire broke out in their Manila apartment, and that alerted the authorities. But KSM's fixation on commercial aviation as a vulnerability remained.
He knew airplanes were the target.
Exactly. So when he met with bin Laden in 1996, his new pitch evolved. It went from simply blowing up planes to actually hijacking commercial airliners and flying them directly into iconic U.S. landmarks.
And the sources note he was also partly inspired by an actual crash, right?
Yeah, the 1999 crash of Egyptair Flight 990. That was deliberately flown into the Atlantic Ocean by its relief first officer.
Right. So KSM walks in with this grand theatrical vision of using planes as missiles. But according to the 9/11 Commission report, bin Laden actually turned him down.
He rejected it outright. At that point in 1996, bin Laden felt the plan was just overly complicated.
Too many moving parts.
Exactly. It required too much specialized training and a level of coordinated infiltration that al-Qaeda simply hadn't mastered yet. He favored simpler, more traditional targets.
Like military installations or embassies.
Right.
So what changed his mind? I mean, the blueprint obviously gets approved eventually.
The shift occurred in late 1998 and early 1999. In August of 1998, al-Qaeda successfully executed simultaneous truck bombings at the United States embassies in Kenya and Tanzania.
And that killed over 200 people.
It did. And the success of that highly coordinated dual-target operation infused bin Laden with a lot of confidence. It also brought a huge surge of recruits and funding into the organization.
So he felt emboldened.
Very much so. Feeling emboldened, bin Laden summoned KSM back and gave him the green light to begin developing a refined version of the airplane plot.
The machine is officially turned on. The blueprint is approved. The recruitment begins, and the operatives start moving. Which brings us to a part of the source material that is just agonizing to read.
The intelligence breakdown.
Yes, the intelligence breakdown. Because the intelligence community was not entirely blind to the fact that al-Qaeda was planning something massive. In the summer of 2001, the internal memos described the intelligence community's threat matrix with a very specific, terrifying phrase.
The system blinking red.
Exactly, a system blinking red.
The anxiety within the upper echelons of the U.S. security apparatus was palpable. You had senior counterterrorism official Richard Clark and Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet receiving an unprecedented volume of threat reporting.
The chatter was deafening.
It really was. The chatter intercepted from known terrorist networks was huge. They were absolutely convinced a spectacular attack was imminent.
And in early July 2001, Clark even ordered domestic agencies to be put on full alert. He issued warnings that something catastrophic was going to happen very soon.
But the blind spot was the geography. The overarching assumption within the CIA and the counterterrorism community was that the attack would happen overseas.
They were bracing for another embassy bombing.
Or an attack on a military barracks in Saudi Arabia, or perhaps a strike against U.S. interests in Israel. They were looking outward, deploying their defensive posture internationally.
And that outward focus created a fatal vulnerability at home. Which brings us to the specific missed connections detailed in the 9/11 Commission report. And these aren't vague, generalized failures.
No, they're highly specific.
They are precise moments where the system had the necessary information in its hands, but failed to act on it. Like the primary example, the Kuala Lumpur meeting.
Right, let's break that down. January 2000, Malaysia. The CIA and the NSA were monitoring a summit of known al-Qaeda operatives in Kuala Lumpur. They were actively tracking the attendees, surveilling the hotel.
Watching everything.
And during this surveillance, they identified two individuals who were clearly integrated into the terror network. Their names were Khalid al-Midar and Nawaf al-Hazmi.
And those names are so critical because less than 2 years later, al-Midar and al-Hazmi would be two of the 5 hijackers who stormed the cockpit of American Airlines Flight 77 and crashed it into the Pentagon.
The intelligence agencies knew these men were dangerous. The CIA actually uncovered that al-Midar held a multiple entry visa, allowing him to travel freely into the United States.
And then a few months later, the agency received definitive intelligence that al-Midar and al-Hazmi had actually flown into Los Angeles. They were living inside the borders of the U.S.
This is the moment where the system should have slammed shut.
Right. The CIA knows 2 al-Qaeda operatives are inside the country, but they do not put them on the State Department's terrorist watch list.
No.
They do not notify U.S. Customs. And, most incomprehensibly, they do not tell the FBI.
Which is the agency entirely responsible for domestic counterterrorism. The failure to inform the FBI is one of the most heavily scrutinized elements of the pre-9/11 intelligence timeline.
That's just wild.
When an FBI agent who was detailed to the CIA's counterterrorism center realized that al-Midar had a U.S. visa and might be heading to New York, he drafted a message to alert the FBI.
You tried to tell them.
He did, but his CIA supervisors explicitly ordered him not to send it. They told him the information was intelligence, not a criminal matter, and therefore it was not the FBI's jurisdiction to know about it.
I really want to zero in on this because to you and me, it sounds like petty bureaucratic rivalry.
Yeah.
But the sources explain it was actually a rigid, legally mandated structure. It was the 1995 Justice Department policy known as the Wall.
Yes, the Wall. If you want to understand how the 9/11 plot survived, you absolutely have to understand the Wall.
So what was it exactly?
The Wall was a set of legal and bureaucratic barriers designed to strictly separate foreign intelligence gathering from domestic criminal investigations. The rationale behind it was historically rooted.
Right, it goes back to the 70s.
Exactly. Following the intelligence scandals of the 1970s, like the abuses uncovered by the Church Committee regarding the CIA and FBI spying on American citizens, there was a profound legal emphasis on protecting civil liberties.
So the fear was that the government would use secret, classified intelligence tools like warrantless wiretaps that are designed for foreign spies to gather evidence for domestic criminal trials.
Right, thereby bypassing the constitutional rights of the accused. So they built the Wall. Intelligence agents legally could not share their findings with criminal investigators.
So I was thinking about an analogy for this. It's like watching 2 doctors treat the exact same patient in the same hospital, but they are legally forbidden from looking at the patient's chart together. One doctor knows the patient is allergic to a medication, the other doctor is about to prescribe it, and neither can pick up the phone.
That's a perfect analogy. That siloed reality is exactly what allowed the operatives to operate freely. And it wasn't just the Malaysia meeting that fell into this void. In July of 2001, an FBI agent stationed in Phoenix, Arizona, noticed a highly disturbing pattern.
The Phoenix Memo.
Yes. This agent writes a detailed report pointing out an unusual, concentrated number of men from the Middle East, some with known extremist connections, enrolling in civil aviation universities and flight schools across the country.
He literally spells it out.
He did. He explicitly theorized that Osama bin Laden might be orchestrating a coordinated effort to infiltrate the U.S. civil aviation system. He recommended a nationwide effort to interview flight school managers and audit these students.
And what happened to the memo?
The memo was sent to FBI headquarters in Washington. It was read by a few mid-level analysts, categorized as speculative, and essentially buried in the bureaucratic backlog.
Unbelievable.
No nationwide action was taken. The dots were collected, but the system lacked the mechanism and the imagination to actually connect them.
Which brings us to August 6, 2001. Just 5 weeks before the attacks, President George W. Bush is at his ranch in Texas, receiving his highly classified presidential daily briefing. And the title of that document is not subtle at all.
Not at all. It is literally headlined, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S.
I mean, you can't get more direct than that.
That briefing summarized years of accumulated intelligence. It noted that al-Qaeda members had resided in or traveled to the U.S. for years. It explicitly mentioned patterns of suspicious activity consistent with preparations for hijackings.
Or other types of attacks. It warned that bin Laden's followers might be targeting New York or Washington.
But despite the title, the administration and the intelligence community viewed the memo as historical context rather than an actionable immediate warning.
They still thought the true threat was overseas.
Exactly. The systemic blind spots held firm. The soundproof rooms remained completely sealed.
But a plot of this magnitude cannot exist solely in memos and theory. Having explored the structural failures that left the door open, we have to shift our analysis to the men who actually walked through it.
Exactly. Who are the operatives tasked with executing KSM's blueprint?
The sources break down the demographics and the internal hierarchy of the 19 hijackers with forensic precision. Let's look at the roster.
So, of the 19 men who boarded those 4 flights, 15 were citizens of Saudi Arabia, 2 were from the United Arab Emirates, 1 was from Lebanon, and 1 was from Egypt.
But they weren't just a monolith, right? They were strictly organized into a 2-tier structure dictated by their roles. You had the pilots and the muscle.
Yes, and the entire operation hinged on the pilots. To find them, bin Laden didn't look to his standard training camps in Afghanistan. He looked to a group of university students living in Germany.
The Hamburg cell.
Right. The core operational leadership of the 9/11 plot was comprised of 4 young men living in Hamburg: Mohamed Atta from Egypt, Marwan al-Shehi from the UAE, Ziad Jarrah from Lebanon, and Ramzi bin al-Shib from Yemen.
And they were like intelligent, radicalized students who independently traveled to Afghanistan in late 1999 seeking to join the jihad, originally intending to fight in Chechnya, right?
Correct. But when bin Laden's deputies intercepted them and brought them to the leader, bin Laden realized he had found the exact missing pieces to KSM's puzzle.
Why them specifical?
Because the initial pool of recruits in the al-Qaeda camps lacked a very specific, vital skill set. They were mostly young men from impoverished, highly restricted societies. They did not speak English, and they had absolutely no experience navigating Western secular culture.
Right. If you send a group of those men into the United States to rent apartments, open bank accounts, and enroll in flight schools, they're going to immediately attract suspicion.
Exactly. The Hamburg cell provided perfect operational security. They were highly educated, fluent in English, and completely accustomed to living in a modern Western city. They knew how to blend in.
So bin Laden personally selects them.
Yes, he personally selected them to be the pilot hijackers, and he appointed the intense, highly disciplined Mohamed Atta as the tactical commander of the entire operation.
There was one significant operational hurdle early on, though. Ramzi bin al-Shib, the Yemeni national.
Right, he repeatedly applied for a U.S. visa to join the others for flight training, but his applications were consistently denied by the State Department.
And not because they knew he was a terrorist, but because they suspected he might overstay his visa for economic reasons.
It's incredible how a mundane immigration check almost derailed a quarter of the leadership team, but they adapted.
They always did.
Bin al-Shib was forced to remain in Europe, functioning as the crucial middleman. He coordinated communications and funneled money from al-Qaeda financiers to the operatives in the U.S. And to replace him as the 4th pilot, al-Qaeda leadership selected Hani Hanjour. He was a Saudi national who already possessed a U.S. commercial pilot's license from previous training, which saved them vital time.
Right. So by mid-2000, Atta, al-Shehi, and Jarrah are successfully embedded in the United States. They move to Florida, enroll at Huffman Aviation, and spend the next year methodically learning how to fly heavy commercial aircraft.
Specifically focusing on navigation and controlling the planes in the air, rather than takeoffs and landings.
Exactly. Then, in the spring and summer of 2001, the second tier of the operation begins to arrive.
The muscle. 15 men, mostly young Saudis, handpicked by bin Laden.
Their role was entirely physical. They did not need to know how to fly. Their assignment was simply to storm the cockpit, use intimidation and violence to subdue the flight crew and the passengers, and secure the front of the aircraft so the pilot hijackers could take the controls. And the sources reveal a deeply disturbing psychological layer regarding these 15 men. We think of 9/11 as a coordinated suicide mission by 19 zealots who all knew exactly what they were signing up for. But that isn't actually true.
No, it's not. Most of the muscle hijackers were kept completely in the dark.
Which is wild to think about.
The 9/11 Commission found compelling evidence, including later audio recordings of bin Laden himself, indicating that the muscle hijackers were not told the true suicidal nature of the operation until just before they boarded the planes.
Perhaps only hours prior.
Right. While Atta and the pilots had spent months preparing themselves for death, writing out their last wills and testaments, the muscle hijackers had not.
So why keep them in the dark? Why wouldn't you tell the guys who were supposed to take over the plane?
It was a brutal calculation of operational security. The more people who know the terrifying truth of a plot, the higher the risk someone will break, confess, or draw attention to themselves out of sheer anxiety.
Okay, so what do they think they were doing?
The muscle hijackers likely believed they were participating in a traditional historical hijacking. You know, taking hostages to demand the release of political prisoners, forcing a plane to land on a tarmac somewhere to negotiate. That had been the standard terrorist playbook since the 1970s.
I want to pause here because if you are listening to this and mapping out the timeline, a massive question naturally arises.
Sure.
You have 19 men. Some of them barely speak English. Some of them have been flagged by the CIA. Some of them are failing out of their flight school exams. How on earth do they successfully navigate the airports, bypass the security checkpoints, and take control of 4 massive domestic airliners on the same morning? Like, did they just overpower the multi-billion-dollar security apparatus of the United States?
The terrifying answer provided by the aviation security reviews is that they did not overpower the system. They didn't need to break the rules because they exploited the system's existing, perfectly legal framework.
How did that actually work in practice? Let's talk about the weapons. He took over 4 planes using box cutters and utility knives.
Right. In a post-9/11 world, where taking a bottle of water through security is a logistical hurdle, it is almost impossible to comprehend the regulations of 2001.
It feels like a different planet.
It really does. The hijackers did not smuggle illegal firearms or explosives past the metal detectors. They carried multifunction hand tools and Leatherman-style utility knives. And under the FAA regulations at the time, knives with blades under 4 inches long were entirely legal to carry onto a commercial airplane.
So they were completely allowed.
Yes. The security personnel who screened Mohamed Atta and the others literally saw the blades, and they legally permitted them through.
That explained how the weapons got onto the plane. But what about the crews? You have 4 unarmed pilots and a handful of flight attendants against dozens of passengers. Why wasn't there immediate, overwhelming resistance the second a knife was drawn?
Because the hijackers possessed a weapon far more effective than the knives. The Federal Aviation Administration's standard protocol for hijackings.
The compliance protocol.
Exactly. For decades prior to 2001, the absolute rule for flight crews and passengers facing a hijacking was strict compliance.
Because historically, hijackers wanted to live.
That's the key. If you look at the hijackings of the 70s and 80s, the perpetrators wanted to leverage the plane and the passengers for media attention, ransom, or prisoner exchanges.
So the logic was, don't agitate them.
The logic of the aviation industry was completely sound based on that history. If you fight back in a pressurized tube miles above the earth, people will die. If you sit quietly, comply with demands, and let the hijackers land the plane, the authorities take over, negotiations begin, and eventually everyone goes home safely.
The entire system, from the airlines to the FAA to law enforcement, simply could not imagine a paradigm where commercial airliners, fully loaded with thousands of gallons of volatile jet fuel, would be utilized as guided, suicidal missiles.
That rigid adherence to an outdated protocol was the linchpin of the entire plot. It was exactly what Atta and the others banked on when they purchased their tickets for a clear Tuesday morning.
The stage is set, the structural blind spots have been navigated, the legal weapons are in their pockets. That takes us to the morning of September 11th, and the minute-by-minute timeline of how the operation was executed.
The tactical design relied on the staggered, synchronized departure of 4 transcontinental flights. The hijackers specifically targeted large Boeing 757s and 767, scheduled for cross-country routes from the East Coast to California.
Right, because of the fuel.
The fuel was the primary weapon. A transcontinental 767 carries up to 24,000 gallons of highly flammable aviation fuel. They weren't just hijacking planes, they were hijacking massive incendiary bombs.
The timeline begins in Boston. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, piloted by Mohamed Atta, takes off bound for Los Angeles. 15 minutes later, at 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 also departs Boston for L.A. Down in Virginia, American Airlines Flight 77 leaves Dulles International Airport at 8:20 a.m. Finally, United Airlines Flight 93 pushes back in Newark, New Jersey.
And what becomes immediately clear when reviewing the flight transcripts and the frantic phone calls made by flight attendants is the chilling uniformity of the hijackers' tactics across all 4 aircraft.
They followed a highly rehearsed script.
They waited until the planes reached cruising altitude, typically 15 to 30 minutes after takeoff, when the seatbelt signs were turned off and the cabin crew began beverage service. Then, the muscle hijackers struck.
And the first step was establishing absolute terror and control. The sources say they used chemical irritants, mace, or pepper spray to blind and incapacitate the first-class passengers and the flight attendants working in the forward galley. They violently forced everyone to the back of the cabin.
Right. And to guarantee the compliance protocol kicked in instantly, they utilized the threat of explosives. Several passengers and crew members reported seeing hijackers wearing devices strapped to their waists with exposed wires.
But the 9/11 Commission exhaustively investigated this and concluded the bombs were almost certainly fake.
Right. Yes. They were constructed from innocuous materials simply to instill paralyzing fear and prevent any heroics.
But they didn't rely solely on the threat of a bomb. They used immediate lethal violence to prove they were serious. The sources document the horrific details. On Flight 11 and Flight 175, flight attendants and a passenger were brutally stabbed in the opening moments of the takeover.
By shedding blood instantly, they extinguished any lingering thought of resistance. The compliance training just took over. With the cabin neutralized, the muscle breached the cockpits, murdered or incapacitated the commercial pilots, and the terrorists trained in Florida took the yokes.
Despite the brutal efficiency of the physical takeovers, the execution of the plot was not flawless. In the chaos of the cockpits, the hijacker pilots made critical technical errors that severely compromised their operational secrecy.
The radio transmissions.
Yes, the radio transmissions.
Both Mohamed Atta on Flight 11 and Ziad Jarrah on Flight 93 intended to broadcast reassuring, pacifying messages over the internal cabin PA systems to keep the passengers docile. However, they were unfamiliar with the specific communication panels under extreme stress, and they pushed the wrong toggles.
So instead of speaking to the cabin, they transmitted their voices directly over the open radio frequencies to air traffic control on the ground.
At 8:24 a.m., controllers in Boston hear Atta's voice crackle over the radio. "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." A few minutes later.
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any moves, you'll endanger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
And then, over an hour later, Ziad Jarrah makes the identical error on Flight 93, broadcasting to controllers in Cleveland. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. Please sit down and keep remaining seating. We have a bomb on board, so sit." Those errors were massive because up until that point, ATC thought they were dealing with routine mechanical failures or, localized communication blackouts. Hearing the hijackers explicitly state, "We have some planes," instantly alerted the authorities that a coordinated multi-plane hijacking was actively underway, linking the vanishing radar blips.
That realization rippled through the aviation system, but the planes were moving too fast, and the military response protocols were too convoluted to intercept them in time.
Except for one flight.
Right. We focus heavily on the anomaly of the day, United Airlines Flight 93, because that is the only aircraft that failed to reach its intended target. And the reason it failed rests entirely on a wildly mundane, everyday inconvenience: morning airport traffic.
Flight 93 was scheduled to push back from its gate in Newark at exactly 8:00 a.m. alongside the other flights. But routine, heavy runway congestion delayed the takeoff. The plane sat idling on the tarmac for 42 agonizing minutes. It didn't actually lift off until 8:42 a.m.
And that 42-minute delay fundamentally altered the course of history, because by the time Ziad Jarrah and his muscle hijackers finally made their move and stormed the cockpit of Flight 93 at 9:28 a.m., the other three planes had already reached their destinations.
The timeline overlapping here is critical. By 9:28 a.m., the entire world knows what is happening, and crucially, the passengers on Flight 93 are about to find out.
Herded to the back of the Boeing 757, the passengers and crew of Flight 93 began picking up the seatback airphones and using their personal cell phones to call their loved ones, authorities, and airline operators, initially just to report the hijacking.
But the people on the ground had the news turned on. The families tearfully informed the passengers about the apocalyptic scenes unfolding in New York. They told them that 2 planes had just been flown directly into the World Trade Center and a third had just struck the Pentagon.
The transmission of that information instantly shattered the hijackers' greatest weapon. In a matter of minutes, the passengers of Flight 93 realized that the compliance protocol was a death sentence.
This was not a hostage negotiation. It was a suicide mission. And if they simply sat in their seats and did nothing, their plane was going to be used as a missile to murder thousands of people on the ground.
That collective realization leads to one of the most profound acts of spontaneous heroism in modern history. The passengers take a vote.
At 9:57 a.m., led by individuals like Todd Beamer, Tom Burnett, and Mark Bingham, the passengers organize a counterattack. They boil water from the galley to throw at the hijackers, they grab food carts to use as battering rams, and they charge down the narrow aisle toward the cockpit.
The audio recovered from the cockpit voice recorder captures the harrowing final minutes. You can hear the sounds of a desperate, violent struggle outside the door, the crashing of the carts, the passengers yelling, trying to batter down the reinforced door.
Inside the cockpit, Jarrah realizes they are about to be overwhelmed. He begins violently pitching the heavy airliner up and down, rolling it sharply left and right, desperately trying to knock the charging passengers off their feet. But the assault doesn't stop. They keep battering the door.
Realizing that the passengers are seconds away from breaching the cockpit and seizing the controls, the hijackers make a final, fatal decision. Rather than surrender the aircraft and allow the plot to be thwarted, Jarrah rolls the 757 completely upside down and pushes the yoke forward, pitching the plane into a terminal nosedive.
At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashes into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at over 580 miles per hour. The crash site was roughly 20 minutes of flying time away from Washington, D.C.
And a 9/11 Commission and intelligence analysts firmly believe the intended target was the symbolic heart of the U.S. government, either the United States Capitol building or the White House.
The 40 passengers and crew members of Flight 93 gave their lives, but through their immediate collective action, they saved the Capitol and prevented an even greater catastrophe.
When you look back at the timeline of that morning, the sheer tactical calculation of the hijackers is terrifying. I want to point out the dark brilliance, and I use that word strictly in a cold, operational sense of the staggered impacts in New York.
It was very calculated.
Hitting the North Tower first at 8:46 a.m. wasn't just about causing damage. It was about creating a spectacle. By crashing American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower, they effectively created a global audience.
Every local news affiliate in New York, and within minutes, every major global news network pointed their cameras at the smoking gash in the North Tower.
But at that moment, nobody knew it was terrorism. Anchors were speculating about a horrific aviation accident, a small commuter plane gone off course. The entire world was watching, trying to understand a tragedy. And then, exactly 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 banks aggressively over the Hudson River and slams into the South Tower.
That 17-minute gap was a psychological weapon. It ensured that hundreds of millions of people worldwide were watching live, in real time, when the second plane hit. The second impact instantly erased any illusion of an accident. It proved, visually and undeniably, that the United States was under a coordinated attack. It maximized the psychological terror on a global scale.
The battle in the skies ended with the crash in Shanksville. But the nightmare on the ground in Lower Manhattan and in Arlington, Virginia was just entering its most catastrophic phase. The physical destruction of that day is almost impossible to fully comprehend, even when watching the endless video loops. Let's delve into the actual physics of what happened to those buildings, because it dictates the human toll.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, spent years conducting exhaustive engineering analyses to understand exactly how the towers fell. When Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., it hit dead center into the north face of the building, tearing a hole from the 93rd to the 99th floor.
I mean, a Boeing 767 flying at 440 miles per hour essentially acts like a massive shotgun blast going off inside the building.
Precisely. The kinetic energy was unfathomable. The nose of the plane, the heavy engines, and the landing gear shredded through the exterior steel columns and plowed directly into the central core of the skyscraper. The impact instantly severed all three of the building's central stairwells.
And that structural reality sealed the fate of everyone above the impact zone. If you were on the 92nd floor or higher in the North Tower, your path to the ground was entirely obliterated in a fraction of a second. The sources estimate that between 1,344 and 402 people were instantly trapped.
Furthermore, the explosion of the jet fuel didn't just cause a fire. The sheer force of the blast stripped the fireproofing insulation directly off the steel columns and trusses over a massive area. The structural skeleton of the building was now entirely exposed to fires that were being fueled by thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and office combustibles, burning at up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit.
17 minutes later, the dynamic repeats, but the physics are crucially different. Flight 175 hits the South Tower.
The impact in the South Tower occurred much lower down, tearing through floors 77 to 85. The plane was flying significantly faster, roughly 540 miles per hour. But most importantly, it did not hit dead center. The plane banked sharply at the last second, striking the building off-center near the corner.
The trajectory of that impact is one of the only slivers of architectural mercy on that day. Because the plane hit at an angle, The heavy engines and debris carved a path through the core that miraculously missed one single continuous stairwell.
Stairwell A. It remained intact from the very top of the building all the way down to the lobby. The smoke and debris made it perilous, but it was passable. That architectural anomaly allowed a small group of people, 18 individuals from the impact zone and the floors above it, to find a way down through the darkness and survive.
But the South Tower's lower impact zone also created a massive vulnerability. Because it was hit around the 80th floor, there was vastly more structural weight bearing down on the damaged and burning columns than there was in the North Tower, which was hit higher up.
There is also a vital human story within the South Tower regarding the 17-minute window between the two impacts.
Right. When the North Tower was hit, the initial announcement over the Port Authority PA system in the South Tower instructed occupants to remain in their offices, stating that their building was secure and evacuation wasn't necessary.
And in the confusion, many people followed those instructions, but some individuals recognized the danger and refused to wait for official permission. A prime example highlighted in the aftermath is Eric Eisenberg, an executive at AON Insurance. AON occupied a massive swath of the Upper South Tower, floors 92 and 98 through 105. The moment the North Tower was struck, Eisenberg didn't wait for an announcement. He immediately ordered a total evacuation of his employees.
Because he made that proactive decision, during those vital 17 minutes, over 900 of AON's 1,100 employees navigated down the stairwells, passing below the 77th floor before Flight 175 hit. Their lives were saved because they ignored the directive to stay put. Eisenberg himself, tragically, remained behind to ensure the floors were clear, and he was among the nearly 200 AON employees who were killed when the plane struck. But his immediate action averted a far greater catastrophe.
Despite those efforts, the fires inside the South Tower were doing catastrophic, invisible damage to the structure. The NIST report details how the intense heat softened the steel trusses that supported the concrete floors. As the steel weakened, those massive floors began to sag. And as they sagged, they acted like giant cables pulling inward on the damaged perimeter columns.
Because the weight distribution was so uneven due to the corner impact and the structural load above the impact zone was so heavy, the South Tower simply couldn't endure. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for exactly 56 minutes, the perimeter columns buckled. The top section of the building tilted, and the South Tower collapsed in on itself in a matter of seconds, unleashing a tidal wave of pulverized debris through the streets of Manhattan.
The North Tower, having been hit higher up and more centrally, maintained its structural equilibrium longer. But the fire was doing the exact same work on the steel. It burned for 1 hour and 42 minutes. At 10:28 a.m., its weakened core columns finally gave way and the North Tower collapsed. Later that evening, at 5:21 p.m., the 47-story 7 World Trade Center, which had been ignited by flaming debris from the North Tower, also suffered a structural failure and collapsed after burning entirely uncontrolled for 7 hours.
While the horror was unfolding in New York, the third strike occurred at the headquarters of the U.S. military. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77, having turned around over the Midwest, slammed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia.
The operational details of the Pentagon strike are staggering. Hani Hanjour executed a complex, descending 330-degree turn at over 500 miles per hour to align with the building. The plane struck the west wall at the first floor level. The kinetic energy was so immense that the aircraft essentially disintegrated upon impact. A tidal wave of debris and jet fuel penetrated 310 feet deep into the structure, blasting through 3 of the Pentagon's 5 concentric reinforced concrete rings.
The human toll there was devastating. All 64 people on the plane were killed, along with 125 people on the ground inside the building, a mix of 70 civilians and 55 military personnel.
Returning to Ground Zero in New York, the aftermath reports heavily focus on the heartbreaking breakdown of the first responder systems. The bravery of the individuals was unparalleled, but the organizational structure failed them. The city lost 343 firefighters, 23 NYPD officers, and 37 Port Authority police officers. The sources point to catastrophic systemic communication failures as a primary driver of that death toll.
The scale of the disaster completely overwhelmed the command and control protocols. You had the FDNY, the NYPD, and the Port Authority Police all responding to the same site, but they set up entirely separate, uncoordinated command posts. They weren't sharing a unified picture of the disaster.
The most fatal flaw was the radio technology. The different agencies operated on incompatible radio frequencies. The NYPD had aviation units, helicopters circling the burning towers. The police pilots had a terrifying, clear view of the structural degradation. They could actually see the exterior columns warping and buckling inward. They were desperately radioing down to police commanders that the buildings looked structurally unsound and a collapse was imminent.
But the fire chiefs, who were setting up staging areas in the lobbies of the towers and sending hundreds of firefighters up the stairs, never heard those warnings, because their radios couldn't receive the NYPD transmissions. When the police commanders issued an emergency evacuation order, most police officers inside the towers received it and had time to escape before the collapse. The vast majority of the firefighters inside never got the message.
It's just a tragic failure of communication infrastructure.
I have to bring something up here, because when we discuss the upper floors and the people trapped above the impact zones, there is a specific, haunting aspect of the tragedy that always demands attention. The photograph known as the falling man. The unimaginable horror of the choice faced by those trapped by the heat and smoke. It's estimated that over 200 people fell or jumped to their deaths. Why wasn't a roof rescue possible? People naturally fled upward, hoping for helicopters, like they had seen in movies or during the 1993 bombing.
It was a tragic, compounding series of logistical failures. First, the Port Authority had locked the roof access doors to prevent vandalism and unauthorized access to the communication antennas. The people fleeing upward hit locked steel doors and didn't have the keys. Second, even if they had reached the roof, the conditions were apocalyptic. The intense heat from the fires and the thick, billowing black smoke creating massive updrafts reduced visibility to zero. The NYPD helicopter pilots attempted to approach the roofs, but determined it was essentially a suicide mission to try and hover over the buildings.
And beyond the smoke, there was a procedural void.
Yes. There simply was no established protocol, no training, and no equipment designed for the mass helicopter evacuation of thousands of panicked people from the roof of a burning 110-story skyscraper. The logistical reality of ferrying people a few at a time in small police choppers amidst a raging inferno was physically impossible. It loops back to the recurring theme, the failure of imagination. The system had never envisioned a scenario where a roof rescue would be the only viable option.
When the towers finally fell, the physical dust began to settle over a devastated lower Manhattan. But the ripple effects of that morning instantly leaped outward, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the entire globe. The transition from a chaotic domestic emergency to a sprawling global wartime footing occurred in a matter of hours.
The timeline of the immediate governmental response is a fascinating study in crisis management and continuity of government.
Let's trace the president's movements. The image is etched into the cultural memory. President George W. Bush is sitting in a second-grade classroom at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Florida, listening to children read. His chief of staff, Andrew Card, walks up behind him and whispers in his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." The president's reaction was heavily scrutinized, but the historical consensus is that he intentionally remained seated for several minutes. He was keenly aware of the press cameras in the back of the room, and he wanted to project a calm, stabilizing demeanor rather than jumping up and inciting panic. But the moment he left the classroom, the machinery of the state engaged fully. He moves to a secure holding room, and from there, boards Air Force One. But Air Force One doesn't fly back to Washington. It essentially transforms into a flying bunker. With rumors of credible threats against the White House and Air Force One itself, the plane zigzags across the country at high altitudes, surrounded by fighter jet escorts, landing briefly at highly secure Air Force bases in Louisiana and Nebraska to establish secure communications.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, Vice President Dick Cheney is evacuated into the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, a bunker deep beneath the White House. Believing that more hijacked commercial airliners are inbound toward the Capitol, Cheney makes a monumental decision. He issues executive authorization for military fighter jets to shoot down any commercial aircraft that remains unresponsive to air traffic control.
It's an agonizing order, authorizing the military to fire missiles at civilian planes filled with American citizens. But before that order has to be tested, the Federal Aviation Administration takes an action that is entirely unprecedented in the history of aviation.
The man at the center of this is Ben Sliney. It is a remarkable historical detail. September 11th, 2001 was Sliney's very first day on the job as the National Operations Manager of the FAA. Faced with an unknown number of hijacked planes, he makes the unprecedented call to invoke SCATANA, the security control of air traffic and air navigation aids.
He essentially hits the kill switch for the entire U.S. airspace.
He issued a blanket order. Every single civilian, commercial, and private aircraft currently in the sky over the United States must land immediately at the nearest suitable airport.
How does that actually work mechanically?
Yeah.
You have over 4,000 planes in the air. You can't just tell them all to drop out of the sky.
It required a Herculean, improvised effort by air traffic controllers across the country. They had to abandon their standard routing protocols. They were frantically vectoring massive jumbo jets into small, regional airports that were never designed to handle them. They were stacking planes wingtip to wingtip on runways and taxiways just to get them on the ground before they ran out of fuel or became potential weapons.
And what about the international flights? There were hundreds of planes halfway across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans heading toward a country that had just closed its borders.
The FAA coordinated with Transport Canada to initiate Operation Yellow Ribbon. All inbound international flights were immediately diverted to airports across Canada. The most famous example is Gander, Newfoundland, a small town of roughly 10,000 people that suddenly found itself hosting nearly 7,000 stranded passengers from 38 wide-body airliners parked on its tarmac.
So the immediate threat in the skies is neutralized. The airspace is silent. But the geopolitical shockwave was just forming. Within 24 hours, the international landscape shifted fundamentally.
The global solidarity was immediate and absolute. On September 12th, NATO invoked Article 5 of its founding treaty. Article 5 is the core principle of collective defense. It states that an armed attack against one member nation is considered an armed attack against all members.
It is the bedrock of the Western military alliance. And it's vital to note that in the entire history of NATO, spanning the Cold War and numerous global conflicts, Article 5 has only been invoked exactly one time, in defense of the United States following the 9/11 attacks.
Armed with that global mandate, the Bush administration rapidly formulated a new, aggressive foreign policy doctrine, launching what became known as the Global War on Terror. The immediate logical target was Afghanistan. The hardline Taliban regime controlling the country was openly providing safe haven and logistical support to Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network.
The military response was swift. By October 7th, less than a month after the towers fell, a U.S.-led coalition supported by British forces and local Afghan opposition groups began a massive bombing campaign against Taliban targets and al-Qaeda training camps. This was immediately followed by a ground invasion, quickly toppling the Taliban government and forcing bin Laden into hiding in the mountains of Tora Bora.
That invasion marked the beginning of a conflict in Afghanistan that would drag on for 2 agonizing decades. But the profound geopolitical shift didn't stop at the Afghan border. The sources explicitly detail how the momentum, the public fear, and the political capital generated by 9/11 were subsequently pivoted toward a completely different target: Iraq.
The invasion of Iraq in 2003 is a highly contentious pivot point. According to the timeline and the Miller Center sources, the Bush administration began aggressively pushing the narrative that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was actively supporting international terrorism and secretly possessing weapons of mass destruction. They utilized the profound national anxiety generated by 9/11 to build public support for a preemptive war.
However, the sources also clearly state that years later, President Bush formally conceded that Saddam Hussein had absolutely no operational role or connection to the September 11th attacks. Yet the invasion proceeded, completely destabilizing the Middle East and sparking a brutal, protracted insurgency.
The human cost of this sprawling, reactive war on terror is almost unfathomable. We were just talking about the 2,977 victims on the day of the attacks. We are looking at the comprehensive data compiled by the Cost of War Project at Brown University. Their research estimates that the various conflicts incited directly by the U.S. response to 9/11 resulted in roughly 4.5 million indirect deaths due to violence, destroyed infrastructure, disease, and starvation. Furthermore, the war has displaced an estimated 38 million people across Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, and other nations, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history.
While the military engaged overseas, the United States fundamentally restructured its domestic government and legal systems to fortify the homeland. The bureaucracy underwent a massive overhaul. The Department of Homeland Security was created, which required folding 22 previously distinct federal departments and agencies into one massive, centralized cabinet-level entity.
And the most visible change for the average citizen was the creation of the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. Prior to 9/11, airport security was handled by private contractors hired by the individual airlines, creating wildly inconsistent standards. The TSA completely federalized the process, instituting the rigid, standardized security checkpoints, baggage screenings, and liquid restrictions that define modern travel.
But the bureaucratic changes were minor compared to the legal shifts. In the frantic weeks following the attacks, Congress rapidly drafted and passed the USA Patriot Act. The legislation was designed to dismantle the very bureaucratic barriers like the wall that had prevented the intelligence agencies from sharing information prior to the attacks.
But tearing down that wall ignited a massive ongoing tension between the necessity of national security and the preservation of civil liberties. The Patriot Act granted the federal government sweeping, unprecedented new powers. It drastically expanded their ability to conduct warrantless wiretaps, to monitor civilian emails and internet activity, and to aggressively search financial and business records without establishing traditional probable cause.
The expansion of power extended into the covert operations of the CIA as well. The agency implemented a global program of extraordinary rendition, secretly kidnapping suspected terrorists and transporting them to black sites, covert, off-the-books prisons located in allied nations.
And inside those black sites, the suspects were subjected to what the government legally euphemized as enhanced interrogation techniques. Let's be clear about the sources here. Extensive investigations by human rights organizations, and ultimately, the comprehensive report issued by the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee definitively classified these techniques, which included sleep deprivation, stress positions, and waterboarding, as torture.
The legal architecture of the War on Terror also led to the establishment of the military detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The facility was explicitly chosen because its location outside the U.S. mainland was designed to place the detainees in a legal black hole, denying them the constitutional protections and due process rights granted by the American judicial system.
The legal shifts extended to the domestic financial sector as well. Fearing that a wave of massive wrongful death lawsuits against the airlines and security companies would bankrupt the aviation industry and severely damage the broader U.S. economy, the government established the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund.
It was an unprecedented legal shield. The federal government essentially offered billions of dollars in taxpayer money to compensate the families of the victims. But the strict caveat was that to accept the funds, the families had to sign a binding agreement relinquishing their right to sue the airlines for negligence.
The issue of liability didn't end there, though. The sources also discuss a later piece of legislation known as JASTA, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. This law effectively overrode the long-standing principle of sovereign immunity, allowing the families of 9/11 victims to bypass diplomatic protections and directly sue the government of Saudi Arabia for its alleged role in supporting the hijackers.
The allegations against Saudi Arabia remain a point of intense geopolitical and legal contention. The sources refer to the infamous 28 pages from a congressional inquiry and a document known as File 17, which critics argue outlines circumstantial ties and financial support flowing between lower-level Saudi intelligence officers or diplomats and some of the hijackers, particularly al-Mihar and al-Hazmi, during their time in California.
It's vital to report impartially on what the sources dictate regarding this. The Saudi Arabian government has consistently, vehemently, and categorically denied any state sponsorship or knowledge of the attacks. Successive U.S. administrations have navigated this issue incredibly carefully, balancing the demands of the victims' families against the strategic necessity of maintaining a vital alliance in the Middle East.
Shifting away from the geopolitical maneuvering, we must address the deeply personal, lingering legacy of the attacks. The long-term health toll inflicted on the people who physically responded to Ground Zero. The devastation didn't stop on September 11th. It became a slow-motion tragedy.
The toxic dust. When millions of tons of concrete, steel, glass, asbestos insulation, heavy metals from electronics, and thousands of gallons of jet fuel were pulverized in the collapse, it created a massive, suffocating cloud of toxic debris that blanketed lower Manhattan and lingered for months.
In the chaotic days immediately following the attack, the Environmental Protection Agency was under immense pressure from the administration to project resilience, reopen Wall Street, and normalize the situation. The EPA issued public statements confidently claiming that the air quality in lower Manhattan was safe to breathe.
That assurance was catastrophically false. The air was saturated with a deadly cocktail of known carcinogens and microscopic particulate matter. Thousands of first responders, construction workers clearing the rubble, and local residents spent months breathing it in, and the consequences have been devastating.
A secondary wave of casualties emerged in the form of severe respiratory illnesses, aggressive cancers, and chronic health conditions directly linked to the toxic exposure. Based on the data in our sources, the FDNY has now lost 299 members to 9/11-related illnesses. That number is staggering when you consider they lost 343 firefighters in the actual day of the attacks. The delayed death toll is approaching the immediate death toll. The NYPD has similarly lost 247 officers to related illnesses.
The economic impact, while secondary to the human loss, was also a seismic shock to the system. The stock market was forced to close completely for almost a week. When it finally reopened, panicked investors triggered a massive sell-off. Over $1.4 trillion in stock valuations simply evaporated in a single week. The physical property damage in Lower Manhattan, encompassing the World Trade Center complex and surrounding buildings, was estimated at over $10 billion.
When you aggregate the geopolitical shifts, the endless wars, the legal restructuring, the health crisis, and the economic damage, a chilling reality about the fundamental nature of modern terrorism emerges.
I want to synthesize the scale of this reaction because I think it reveals exactly why the plot was so devastating. The core goal of a massive terrorist act isn't simply the immediate physical destruction. Bin Laden knew that knocking down 2 buildings and damaging the Pentagon wouldn't magically dissolve the United States government. A superpower can absorb a physical blow. The true tactical goal of asymmetric warfare is to provoke a massive, draining, unchecked overreaction from the target.
It is entirely a strategy of exhaustion. You leverage a tiny input to force the adversary to expend a catastrophic amount of resources.
Exactly. Look at the balance sheet. According to the intelligence estimates, Osama bin Laden spent roughly $500,000 to fund the training and logistics of the 9/11 plot, $50,000. In response, the United States spent upwards of $8 trillion prosecuting the global war on terror. It spent 20 years mired in complex, unwinnable overseas conflicts that drained its military and its treasury. It fundamentally restructured its domestic society, permanently altered the civil liberties of its citizens, and created massive permanent new security bureaucracies. By provoking that staggering multi-trillion-dollar, 2-decade-long response, bin Laden's original $500,000 strategy essentially worked exactly as he intended it to.
It is a profoundly sobering analysis. Asymmetrical warfare is designed to use a small, leveraged action to force a massive, clumsy, and economically ruinous reaction from a much larger, more powerful opponent. The damage isn't just in the initial strike, it's in the frantic flailing of the giant trying to swat the bee.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive. Let's briefly recount the incredible chain of events that transformed the world.
We tracked the origins from a deeply held grievance to a theoretical pitch in 1996 that was initially rejected for being too complicated. We examined the glaring intelligence failures, the crucial memos buried in inboxes, and the rigid legal wall that prevented the sharing of vital data. We traced the path of 19 men, led by the Hamburg cell, who didn't overpower the system, but rather exploited standard legal aviation rules to take control of 4 airliners.
We walked through the harrowing minute-by-minute chaos of a Tuesday morning that permanently shattered the illusion of impenetrable American security. We witnessed the physics of the destruction, the tragic loss of nearly 3,000 lives in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and the heroism of the passengers on Flight 93. And we charted the sprawling aftermath, the instantaneous grounding of the aviation system, a completely reshaped geopolitical map, 2 decades of warfare, and a tragic ongoing health crisis for the first responders who ran into the toxic dust.
It is a history that is not confined to the past. It is actively unfolding around us. The physical site of the World Trade Center has been rebuilt, but the geopolitical, legal, and societal scars left by the attacks remain incredibly visible in our daily lives.
And that brings us to our final thought. The 9/11 Commission report concluded its exhaustive investigation by stating that the single greatest failure leading up to the attacks wasn't a lack of funding or a lack of raw data, it was a failure of imagination.
The immense intelligence and security bureaucracies in place in 2001 were built perfectly to stop the threats of the 1980s. They were looking for state-sponsored spies or traditional hijackers who wanted to land a plane and negotiate for prisoners. They simply could not imagine a scenario where a commercial airplane operating entirely within the legal rules until the final moments would be used as a suicidal cruise missile.
So I want to address you, the listener, directly. Look at the incredibly complex world you inhabit today. We are surrounded by accelerating, wildly untested technologies. We have generative artificial intelligence capable of deep-faking reality. We have autonomous, state-sponsored cyber warfare capabilities that could blind a power grid in seconds. We have the rapid advancement of synthetic biological engineering. Meanwhile, we still have vast, slow-moving bureaucracies that are, by their very nature, always wired to fight the last war.
Exactly right.
So here is the question you have to mull over as you navigate this world. What unimaginable threat is currently sitting in a memo on someone's desk right now? What warning sign is blinking red, being dismissed as science fiction or statistically impossible, simply because the current system cannot possess the imagination to realize it is actually happening? History guarantees that the next defining threat will rarely look anything like the last one. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.